Berlin, 1944. The sky, once the undisputed domain of the Luftwaffe, was now sliced by a new shadow. On the horizon, the metallic glint of a wing reflected the morning sun. A German pilot, a veteran of hundreds of missions, felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. A chill down his spine, that primal tremor Carl Jung would call the encounter with the numinous, the overwhelming experience before the unknown that evokes both terror and fascination. What he saw wasn't just another aircraft. It was the P-51 Mustang, the physical manifestation of a collective psychic upheaval. "It was as if the rug had been pulled out from under me," wrote Lieutenant Hans Schmidt in his diary, discovered years later. "We always knew we were the masters of the sky. Our Messerschmitts were invincible, our Focke-Wulfs unbeatable. That's what they told us, that's what we believed. It was our personal and national myth. But that day, when I saw that American Mustang chasing me beyond what I thought was possible, I felt something inside me crumble." The introduction of the P-51D Mustangs to the European theater in 1944 wasn't just a tactical shift in air warfare. It was a seismic shock to the collective psyche of the German Air Force. Until then, Allied pilots operated aircraft with limited range, offering bombers only partial protection on their raids over Reich territory. German pilots had built their identity around a certainty: the heart of Germany was protected. This certainty was not merely strategic, but psychological, a fundamental pillar of their ontological security. Jung would tell us that what followed was a collapse of the persona, that mask we wear to present ourselves to the world, and often to ourselves. The persona of the invincible, superior, technologically unbeatable German pilot shattered in the skies over Berlin, Dresden, and Munich when the Mustangs appeared, escorting bombers deep into Germany and staying there, hunting, dominating a space the Germans believed was exclusively theirs. The statistics speak for themselves. Between January and April 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 33% of its experienced pilots, not just due to direct shootdowns, but because the presence of the Mustangs made every mission a psychological nightmare. Medical reports from the era record a 400% increase in cases of combat fatigue, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, among German pilots after the massive introduction of P-51s into European skies.
"The unconscious always knows first," Jung wrote in Man and His Symbols. And indeed, weeks before the first fatal encounters with the Mustangs, German pilots reported disturbing dreams of being chased by tireless shadows, of silver aircraft appearing from impossible places, of endless falls. The collective unconscious was preparing these men for the psychic upheaval to come. Adolf Galland, a Luftwaffe general, described in his memoirs how an experienced pilot entered his office after an encounter with Mustangs over Berlin. His eyes were vacant, as if he'd seen a ghost. He wasn't trembling, he wasn't speaking loudly, but there was a disturbing stillness about him. "Sir," he finally said, "they were there before us, they'll be there after us, and they can stay longer than us. The war is lost." It wasn't just a tactical assessment, it was the recognition of a man who had met his shadow. The shadow, in Jungian understanding, is that part of us that we repress, deny, hide from ourselves. For the Luftwaffe pilot, raised in the myth of Aryan superiority, trained in the certainty of German technological supremacy, the shadow was vulnerability, the possibility of defeat, mortality. And the Mustangs, with their silver fuselages glinting in the sun, became the physical manifestation of this shadow. What few military historians analyze is the psychic transformation that accompanies the collapse of a professional identity. When a pilot trained to see himself as a predator suddenly becomes prey, what Jung would call enantiodromia occurs, the transformation of something into its opposite. The hunter becomes the hunted, the invincible becomes vulnerable, certainty transforms into existential doubt. A secret Luftwaffe report, declassified only in the 1970s, revealed that 40% of pilots who survived encounters with Mustangs reported episodes of momentary paralysis, crucial seconds of inaction during combat when they simply couldn't react. This phenomenon, which commanders attributed to cowardice or lack of training, would be explained by Jung as the moment of psychic petrification that occurs when the ego encounters something it cannot immediately integrate. In the seconds I saw that aircraft following me where no enemy fighter should be able to go, I felt like I was in one of my recurring nightmares, wrote Captain Werner Mulders in a letter home a week before his final shoot-down. It was as if my body knew something fundamental had changed in the world,
even before my mind could accept it. Think for a moment about what it means for a young German pilot, many were only 20 or 22 years old, to discover that everything they'd been told about their superiority was a lie. This isn't just a tactical adjustment, it's an existential crisis. It's the moment when the hero of a personal myth discovers he's not the protagonist, but merely a secondary character in a story that won't end as he imagined. The P-51 Mustangs had a concrete technical advantage. With their auxiliary fuel tanks, they could fly over 1,100 miles on escort missions, remaining airborne for more than 7 hours. For German pilots, accustomed to adversaries who had to abandon combat after a few minutes due to fuel limitations, this was almost supernatural. As one captured pilot said during interrogation, "It was like fighting ghosts. They shouldn't have been there, but they were. They shouldn't have been able to follow me for so long, but they did. It was as if the laws of physics had suddenly changed." This sensation that the very laws of reality had been altered is precisely the kind of experience Jung would identify as a moment of the unconscious erupting into consciousness, when our existing cognitive structures can no longer explain the reality we perceive. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to have your entire worldview, your professional confidence, your whole sense of identity crumble in a matter of minutes? That's exactly what German pilots experienced when they realized the Mustangs weren't just another enemy aircraft, but a psychological turning point in the war. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next videos on the psychology of decisive historical moments. In the next part, we'll explore how this transformation in the consciousness of German pilots was reflected in their tactical decisions and, more deeply, in their relationship with the regime they served. As 1944 progressed, something beyond mere tactical disadvantage began to manifest among Luftwaffe squadrons. It was what Jung would call psychic contagion, the spread of a collective emotional state that transcends individual experience. In the barracks and briefing rooms, the silence grew heavier. Fear, once a shameful secret kept by each pilot, now became a shared miasma. No one spoke directly about it, reported Sergeant Eric Weber, one of the few survivors of his squadron, but we all knew. We saw it in each other's eyes during breakfast. Who would encounter a Mustang today? Who wouldn't return? It was as if we were living a daily ritual of sacrifice. The phenomenon Weber describes is precisely what Jung would identify as the encounter with the archetype of death. Not just physical death, but psychic death, the dissolution of a constructed identity. When German pilots took off, they weren't just risking their lives, something they'd always done, but facing the growing certainty that the myth sustaining those lives was disintegrating. A technical report dated March 1944 reveals a surprising fact. After the introduction of P-51D Mustangs equipped with Packard V1650 engines, a version of the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin, German pilots began reporting technical failures in their aircraft 35% more frequently than in the previous period, returning to base without completing missions. Later analyses showed that many of these aircraft had no actual defects. In Jungian language, this was an act of unconscious self-preservation, the psyche protecting itself from complete disintegration by creating a face-saving way out. It wasn't conscious cowardice, but a profound reorganization of psychic priorities that happens when the ego can no longer sustain its illusion of invulnerability. Particularly interesting is the emergence of what the pilots themselves called the Mustang dream, a recurring nightmare reported by dozens of German aviators. They were flying, alone, when their aircraft transformed into transparent glass. From afar, they saw a silver dot growing on the horizon. They knew it was a Mustang, but they couldn't evade or accelerate. When they tried to use the radio, their voices came out in English. They woke up at the exact moment the Mustang opened fire. Jung would interpret this collective dream as a powerful manifestation of the collective unconscious processing a truth unbearable for the conscious ego, the complete inversion of the predator-prey dynamic that defined the identity of the German fighter pilot. Survival strategies began to evolve. Veteran pilots developed what they called a sixth sense, an almost intuitive ability to detect approaching Mustangs even before they appeared visually. It was like feeling a storm approaching, explained Lieutenant Karl Mueller, one of the few surviving aces from the end of the war. There was something in the air, a tension I can't explain. Many called it superstition, but those who ignored that feeling rarely returned.
What Mueller describes would be, in Jungian terminology, a manifestation of the intuitive function, one of the four fundamental psychological functions Jung identified. When conscious reason and logic, the thinking function, fail to process an overwhelming reality, intuition, rooted more deeply in the unconscious, takes over. Have you ever experienced that inexplicable feeling of imminent danger that later proved correct? It's this non-rational knowledge that many German pilots developed as a survival mechanism. Perhaps the most revealing account comes from Luftwaffe psychiatrist Dr. Heinrich Brenner, who interviewed dozens of pilots temporarily withdrawn from combat due to operational fatigue. In his notes, Brenner observes, "The most disturbing thing is not the fear of death, which all combatants face, but the disintegration of a system of meaning. These men lost not only the certainty of victory, but the understanding of their place in the world. It's as if the universe they inhabited had suddenly revealed itself to be much larger and more hostile than they ever imagined." This is precisely the kind of crisis Jung would describe as a crucial moment in the process of individuation, when ego-sustained illusions are forced to yield before a larger, more complex reality. For many of these pilots, this individuation process would be tragically cut short by an untimely death. For others, it would be the beginning of a profound personal transformation. Tell me in the comments, can you imagine what it would be like to have all your professional confidence and identity challenged so abruptly? Have you ever had an experience where you had to recognize that you weren't as invulnerable as you thought? The summer of 1944 marked a turning point not only in air warfare, but in the collective psyche of the Luftwaffe. It's here that we observe what Jung would call the confrontation with the collective shadow, when an entire culture is forced to confront aspects of itself it had denied or repressed. For the German pilots raised in the certainty of the Reich's technological and racial superiority, the undisputed dominance of the Mustangs in the skies represented an intolerable contradiction to their worldview. After my third encounter with the P-51s, I realized there was something profoundly wrong with everything we'd been told, wrote Captain Werner Schroer in a confidential memo that would only be discovered decades later. If they were wrong about our superiority in the skies, what else could they be lying about? This thought was more terrifying than any Mustang. The doubt Schroer expresses is not merely strategic or tactical, it is existential. Jung would tell us that when a fundamental element of one's worldview is challenged, the entire psychic structure begins to crumble.
Statistics confirm this psychological disintegration. Between May and August 1944, the desertion rate among Luftwaffe pilots increased by 280%, an unprecedented number for such a highly indoctrinated elite force. What is particularly fascinating, from a Jungian perspective, is how many pilots described a strange sense of recognition upon encountering the Mustangs for the first time. "It was as if I'd always known this moment would come," reported Hans Meyer, a survivor captured after being shot down over France. "As if my body recognized that silhouette even before my eyes clearly saw it. There was a terrible familiarity in that encounter." This recognition, Meyer describes, is what Jung would call a confrontation with archetypal content, something that already existed in the unconscious, awaiting manifestation in external reality. In the case of the German pilots, it was the archetype of nemesis, the balancing force that inevitably arises to challenge hubris, unbridled arrogance. An extraordinary phenomenon began to emerge in interviews with German prisoners of war. When interrogated about their experiences with the Mustangs, many pilots described the American fighter using almost mythological language. An Allied intelligence report noted, "Prisoners frequently refer to P-51s using terms like silver ghosts, hunters, or even avenging angels." There is an almost superstitious quality to how they discuss these aircraft, unlike how they speak of Spitfires or Thunderbolts. This mythologization of the adversary is precisely what Jung would identify as the projection of the shadow archetype. When we attribute supernatural or demonic qualities to that which represents our own denied vulnerability. For the German pilot who had embodied the myth of invincibility, the Mustang was not just a superior machine. It was the material incarnation of his own repressed fear, now manifested in the external world. The transformation in collective consciousness even reached everyday language. On Luftwaffe bases, a new term emerged, Mustangwetter, Mustang weather. It referred to clear days with good visibility.
Ideal for air operations, which pilots once celebrated, but now inspired dread. No one smiled anymore when the sun shone, a ground mechanic recalled. The blue sky had become our enemy. This symbolic inversion, when something previously positive becomes threatening, is a psychological phenomenon Jung studied extensively in symbols of transformation. It represents a fundamental reorganization of perception under the pressure of a traumatic reality. Luftwaffe medical archives reveal another significant data point. From mid-1944 onward, there was a 320% increase in cases of pilots reporting prophetic dreams, visions, and déjà vu experiences during combat. In Jungian language, this would indicate that under extreme stress, the barrier between conscious and unconscious became more permeable, allowing archetypal content to erupt into consciousness. A particularly notable case is that of Lieutenant Franz Stigler, who, after surviving 3 encounters with Mustangs, began obsessively drawing the same image, a man falling in a spiral, surrounded by winged shadows. When questioned, Stigler claimed not to understand the meaning of the drawing, only felt compelled to create it repeatedly. This behavior, which his superiors considered worrisome, would be interpreted by Jung as an attempt by the unconscious to process and integrate trauma through symbolic expression. Comment below if you believe that extreme moments like these reveal aspects of our psyche that normally remain hidden. Have you ever had an experience that fundamentally changed your view of yourself? As we move into the final months of 1944 and early 1945, we observe a fascinating transformation in the psychology of surviving German pilots. Those who had repeatedly faced Mustangs and survived developed what Jung would call partial integration of the shadow, an ability to recognize and incorporate previously denied aspects of reality. The novices still talked about defeating the Americans, reclaiming the sky, Major Hans-Joachim Marseille recounted in his last notes. We, the veterans, knew that was a fantasy. Our goal had changed, no longer to win, but to survive. It was a silent but profound shift. We saw the world as it truly was, not as we wished it to be. This evolution of consciousness, though painful, represents what Jung would describe in The Development of Personality as an essential step in the process of individuation, the ability to abandon comforting illusions in favor of a more authentic perception of reality. For many of these pilots, this meant an internal detachment from the regime's ideology, even as they continued to fulfill their military duties. An extraordinary document illustrating this transformation is the so-called Mustang Survival Manual, an unofficial text secretly compiled by veteran pilots and circulated clandestinely among squadrons. While official doctrines still insisted that German fighters were superior when flown correctly, this manual began with a revealing sentence: "The P-51 is superior in speed, range, and above 20,000 feet in maneuverability. Accept this fact or die." This acceptance of reality, however painful for national and professional pride, saved countless lives. Statistics confirm pilots who received this manual were 40% more likely to survive encounters with Mustangs than those who followed only official tactics. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung describes how the recognition and acceptance of limitations is, paradoxically, a necessary step to transcend them. Pilots who managed to accept the Mustang's superiority developed innovative tactics that partially compensated for their disadvantage. No longer trying to beat the P-51 at its own game, they adapted their approaches. Low-altitude flights where the Mustang was less efficient, quick and evasive attacks, strategic use of weather conditions. A notable case was recorded by the commander of JG-26, a fighter group stationed in western Germany. He observed that his pilots began painting small Mustang symbols in their quarters, not as targets to be destroyed, but as a kind of protective charm. It's as if, by acknowledging the enemy's power, they tried to somehow incorporate it, he wrote, perplexed. In Jungian analysis, this behavior represents an unconscious attempt at symbolic integration, to psychically assimilate what cannot be defeated externally. The material degradation of the Luftwaffe in the last months of the war, the scarcity of fuel, parts, and even trained pilots, only deepened this psychic crisis. An internal report from December 1944 reveals that 68% of pilots sent to intercept bomber formations believed they would not return from their mission. This certainty of defeat, however, produced a paradoxical phenomenon that Jung would have recognized, a kind of existential freedom. "When you accept that you will probably die today, something strange happens," wrote Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann 3 days before being shot down over Dresden. "The lies we tell ourselves dissolve. I see now that we were never the supermen they told us we were. We are just men, facing superior machines flown by men as determined as us. There's a strange peace in this clarity." This strange peace, Hoffmann describes, is precisely what Jung would identify as the result of integrating shadow content. When previously denied aspects of reality are finally accepted and incorporated into consciousness. It's no coincidence that several pilot accounts from this final period describe an almost transcendental quality in their combat experiences, even in the face of imminent defeat. Luftwaffe psychiatrist Victor von Weizsäcker, influenced by Jung's work, documented what he called terminal clarity phenomenon among pilots who had internally accepted defeat. They describe a peculiar quality of heightened perception, he noted. More vivid colors, time seeming to move more slowly, a sharp awareness of every detail. It's not fear, but a kind of absolute presence in the moment. This altered state of consciousness, which von Weizsäcker compared to mystical experiences described in religious traditions, represents what Jung would call the transcendent function, the emergence of a third psychic position that transcends the opposition between victory and defeat, between life and death. Share this video with a friend or family member interested in history or psychology.
In the final part, we'll explore how this psychic transformation of German pilots influenced the post-war era and what lessons we can draw today from this fascinating chapter of human psychological history. The psychological legacy of this confrontation between Luftwaffe pilots and the P-51 Mustangs transcends the immediate context of the war. In the post-war years, when researchers finally gained access to diaries, letters, and were able to interview survivors from both sides, a fascinating pattern emerged that Carl Jung would have recognized as the process of transformation through collective trauma. Adolf Galland, one of the most renowned German aces, wrote in his memoirs, The First and the Last, "What we lost in the skies was more than an air battle. It was the destruction of a certainty."
None of us who survived that period could continue to see the world in the same way. This observation precisely captures what Jung would call the death and rebirth of the ego, when a previous psychic structure is demolished, allowing the emergence of a new configuration of consciousness. Post-war statistics are revealing. Among surviving German pilots interviewed for historical studies, 72% reported that their worldview had been fundamentally altered by the experience of fighting the Mustangs. More significantly, 64% of those who had been staunch supporters of the Nazi regime described an ideological distancing that began specifically after they recognized that propaganda about German technological superiority was false. "It was as if a first crack appeared in a wall," explained Lieutenant Gerhard Barkhorn in a 1975 interview. "First, you realize the Mustangs are superior, contradicting what you were told. Then you start to question, what else could be a lie? The crack spreads until the whole structure collapses." This sequence Barkhorn describes is precisely the process Jung details in psychology and religion, where he demonstrates how the disintegration of a belief system often begins at a specific, concrete point before spreading to the entire psychic structure. Particularly notable is the phenomenon documented by American military psychologist Robert J. Lifton, who interviewed dozens of former German pilots in the 1950s. He identified what he called technical revelation syndrome, when an individual indoctrinated in a closed ideological system experiences an irrefutable technical or factual contradiction that paves the way for a broader collapse of convictions. For many of these men, Lifton wrote, the moment they realized the Mustang could accompany them at any altitude, surpass their speed, and remain airborne longer than their own fighters was the moment when the entire mythology of Aryan superiority began to crumble. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when ego inflation, the excessive identification with a grandiose collective ideal, is forced to confront reality, resulting in the deflation necessary for more authentic psychic development. There is something profoundly human and universal in this experience. We all construct narratives about ourselves, our groups, our capabilities. When these narratives violently collide with reality, the psychic transformation that follows can be devastating or liberating, often both. A fascinating document emerged from Soviet archives in the 1990s, transcripts of interrogations of German pilots captured on the Eastern Front, who had previously fought Mustangs in the West. A Soviet officer noted, perplexed, "These men speak of the American fighters with an almost religious reverence, as if the encounter with these machines had been some kind of conversion experience." This accidental observation precisely captures what Jung would describe as a numinous encounter, when the human psyche confronts something that so fundamentally challenges its existing structures that the experience acquires an almost sacred, even if traumatic, quality. The final numbers are grim and revealing. Of the approximately 5,000 fighter pilots serving in the Luftwaffe when the Mustangs began to dominate European skies, fewer than 1,200 survived the war. Of these, an estimated only 300 faced Mustangs more than 3 times and lived to tell the tale. These statistics represent not just military losses, but a decimation of an entire generation and its worldview.
A study conducted in the 1980s with the then elderly survivors revealed another intriguing pattern. Those who had managed to psychologically integrate the traumatic experience of facing the Mustangs, recognizing their own limitations and the fallibility of their previous beliefs, demonstrated significantly better long-term mental health than those who had clung to externalizing explanations, such as betrayal or sabotage. This pattern is perfectly consistent with Jungian theory of individuation, which postulates that the integration of shadow experiences, even traumatic ones, is essential for the development of a more complete and resilient personality. Perhaps the most profound reflection on this psychic transformation comes from Carl Jung himself, who, though not writing specifically about fighter pilots, captured the universal essence of this experience in Modern Man in Search of a Soul. The encounter with the other, whether it be an external enemy or denied aspects of ourselves, is always potentially transformative. It is in the mirror of the other that we both recognize and transcend ourselves. For the young Luftwaffe pilots, the P-51 Mustangs became that mirror, a reflective surface that showed not only their technological limitations, but the fundamental flaws in the collective narratives they had embraced. Those who survived the reflection emerged transformed.
The lessons from this chapter of human psychological history remain profoundly relevant today. In a world where simplistic narratives of superiority, invincibility, and exceptionalism remain seductive, the story of German pilots confronting their Mustangs reminds us that it is often in the moment of greatest vulnerability and defeat that the deepest opportunities for psychic growth emerge. As Jung wrote in a passage that seems to echo the experience of these pilots, "It is not by becoming stronger that we overcome our difficulties, but by becoming more conscious." For those young Germans in the cockpits of their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, confronting the silver reality of the Mustangs that outmatched them in every aspect, this consciousness came at a terrible price. But for those who managed to integrate it, it also brought a freedom that transcended victory or defeat in the skies of Europe. If you enjoyed this deep dive into psychology during crucial historical moments, subscribe to the channel right now and hit the notification bell to receive updates on our next videos. And tell me in the comments, what other historical moment would you like us to analyze through the lens of Jungian psychology? Your answer might inspire our next video.